Warning, this video contains 34 references to scientific articles and medical studies. Hello kindred longevity lifestyle designers, this is Zachary with secretsoflongevity.com. This video is part of an ongoing series on the benefits and health properties of animal foods and exploring the scientific basis for why that is so. So at any point you can go to this button in the top right hand corner of your screen, which will take you to sort of the table of contents video that shows the different topics that are all part of this ongoing series. This is number 3 or 4 in the video series, and again, if you want to check out those latter topics, definitely check that out. And if you feel to comment, by all means do so. You don't have to agree with what I'm saying, but if you want me to respond specifically to you, by all means I encourage you to make a video response, because I won't be debating with people in the comments, because I do provide a lot of information in these videos and it's unlikely that you've probably watched them all. Most people I speak to, either online or in person, don't fully understand the physiology and the effects of animal foods in the body, and at one point I didn't understand this myself, but through study and interactions with people who did understand it, they brought this information to my awareness, and I found it as well. And it's brought me to a place where it is almost unquestionable that I can think differently unless there was a large amount of information that contradicted what I'm about to explain in this video, as well as all the videos in this series. So I'm very specific on being scientifically based in my beliefs about anything, and I do not have any time for dealing with dogma. So again, if you want to make a video response to me, I highly recommend that you, if you want me to approve it and respond to it, it needs to be well researched and coming from a place of genuine interest in knowing the truth, the scientific truth about this topic, animal foods versus plant-based foods, or sort of an omnivorous diet versus a almost entirely plant-based or entirely plant-based diet. So the first and most controversial topic we're going to discuss is cholesterol. Most people have the assumption, the mainstream belief, if you go out there and ask what heart disease is caused by, they say cholesterol, and they say, how does that get there? Well, cholesterol-containing foods, you eat these foods, cholesterol ends up in your bloodstream and it sticks to the walls of your arteries like almost the way like a drain would get clogged up in a kitchen sink. So this is completely not how this functions in the body. Even mainstream thinking doctors who believe that cholesterol causes heart disease, they know that it's not just going into the bloodstream and sticking to the walls of the arteries. It's a much more complicated process in the way that that takes place, and there's a very strong tendency for people, even in the health community, to simplify things to the point where they make sense to us logically in the way that we understand things. But really the body is very deceptive in the way it works, and that's what I'll be discussing in this video. So the number 1 link, or study number 1, or reference number 1, I'm going to number off each study or reference as I discuss it, is a review of many studies, and it is explaining the questionable wisdom of lowering cholesterol dietarily as well as with drugs to elicit better health, whether it's cardiovascular, cancer, overall mortality. It all is, at least their conclusion, is decreased. So the possibility of those occurring is increased by the lowering of cholesterol. So lowering cholesterol does not decrease the occurrence of these things. So again, any links I talk about you can find in the drop-down menu below. If you happen to be watching this on any platform other than YouTube, you can go to the bottom right-hand corner of the YouTube screen, actually just below the screen where there's a button that has the YouTube logo, and you click that and it takes you to YouTube. And that's how you can access this drop-down menu, which gives you all the links and references I'm referring to. So in there you'll find all 34 of these references I talk about in this video to prove my point. So the next 5 studies that I reference are all basically coming to the same broad conclusion that lowering cholesterol increases mortality rates. This is something that was seen in all the old-time cholesterol studies, including the Framingham study and all these other ones, which I will discuss those major studies in another video in this series. But what we see is that the lowering of cholesterol increases overall mortality from all causes. So number 2 that's the second link, is a study that showed that those living after 80 in Iceland, in a specific community, found that they had lowered mortality when their cholesterol levels remained higher. So yeah, definitely check that out if you want to learn more about that study and what was going on with it. And that one was out of the Lancet. And link number 3, which was a review of studies, again, this was in the British Medical Journal, was specifically looking, it was a study on studies, it was looking at how often studies were cited that supported cholesterol being lowered as being favorable for heart health, brain health, basically all manner of positive health outcomes. And what they found when looking at different time frames was that the studies that supported these researchers' views were cited the most frequently. So say they had, this wasn't an exact amount, say they had 10 studies, 4 of them supported low cholesterol as being beneficial to one's health, and 6 of them said that having higher cholesterol was good for your health. Those 4 were cited up to 6 times more frequently by researchers in doing other research, whether writing books or anything else, 6 times more frequently than the other studies. So that's a preferential treatment of people's ideologies coming into play. So they have a certain belief system, and this is seen very much frequently in the nutrition field, where the same studies are promoted when there's actually a much larger base of studies out there that are promoting or indicating the opposite to what's being said. So this is not being critical and having an open mind. It's actually showing that a lot of people are capable of getting stuck into dogma and sticking to their guns, so to speak, in trying to prove their point because they have some sort of investment, whether it's financial, emotional, mental. So that's an important thing to take into consideration when looking at any sort of scientific literature. There can be things that say, yes, this is good, and there's other things that say this is bad, but what has the most weight to it? What is the best done studies? Which are the best controlled? Which are the best designed studies? Which side are they on? And when you start to look at factors like that, you can start to see the truth behind these things. So link number 4 in the references below was a study that looked at survival to age 85 in men. So it was looking at the likelihood of men getting to age 85. So for every 10 milligram per deciliter increment or raising increment of HDL cholesterol was associated with a 14% decrease in risk of mortality before that age of the reference to the age of 85. So if HDL is low, it's very clear that people are not going to be as healthy for the long term. That number needs to be very high as you can get it, basically. However, when people look at overall cholesterol levels and they just take that overall number and they don't take into account that that's a fraction of a whole variety of different lipoproteins, and that HDL stands for high-density lipoprotein, that's a very beneficial one to have, high. Almost all of that total cholesterol could be HDL, yet if a doctor sees a high cholesterol level, or someone that sees cholesterol as being bad, they read that on your blood work results, they're going to insist that you lower it in some way, whether it's dietarily or using a drug. And that is definitely not what you want to be doing, because HDL cholesterol is very important for preventing heart disease, and that is well accepted in the mainstream, but still there's that very old school thought system that says all cholesterol is bad, and that's just simply not true even in mainstream medical understanding today. But we're going to push the boundaries a little more, and as you'll see later on with more references, that there's a lot more of the cholesterol containing lipoproteins that are actually beneficial. Link number 5 was a study on declining cholesterol levels in older nursing home residents, and it was looking at the percentage of decline of cholesterol in these individuals and how that reflected on their survival rates. So the faster that cholesterol declined, they found that the faster people were dying. And the biggest increment was 20% per year. So 20% decline in cholesterol per year resulted in a very rapid death in the majority of people. So that was not 85% of residents that had 20% drop in their cholesterol levels died that year. So that's only 15% survival rate. Link number 6 was a study out of the Lancet that I referenced. And this is a study that shows that the cholesterol is a risk factor for women And it really, again, showed the same trend I'm talking about here, that when cholesterol is lowered, death rates went up. And this was actually independent of cancer rates. So they actually excluded the cancer rates just because cancer is actually associated with lowered cholesterol. And that, actually, there is a lot of agreement about. But you don't hear that many vegetarians and vegans talking about that, or at least the health leaders. So even when they removed that factor, which would generally show even more increase in deaths from lowering cholesterol, they still found overall people were dying more when they had lower cholesterol than when they had higher cholesterol. So this relationship was true irrespective of age, blood pressure, body weight, history of heart attacks, creatine clearance, and plasma proteins. So when they took all this into account and divvied up the information anyway, they still found that lowered cholesterol increases mortality in women. And link number 7 is one on men, just like I wanted to do one on specifically men and women. And again, it clearly showed men live longer when their cholesterol is higher. So men with cholesterol less than or equal to 156 milligrams per deciliter and hematocrit less than or equal to 41% died at a rate of 42 times the rate of men with values above those thresholds. So that's a lot when you think of 42 times. That's something that you really can't deny as being some vague margin of possibly error. That's a big difference, 42 times. So those were the 5 studies that looked at lowering cholesterol as causing an increase in mortality. And then this next thing I'm going to be talking about is more along the lines of heart health and its effect, cholesterol's effect on that. So low cholesterol and low saturated fat diets do not lower heart disease risk, and this is link number 8. It's a full study, so it's not just the abstract, and it's also a PDF, so when you click that link, number 8, it's actually going to start a download happening. And it is also a review-based study, so it's looking again at a wide selection of different studies and drawing a conclusion from them, and correcting, possibly in some of the cases, the incorrect assumptions and bad science that those studies were perpetrating. And it came to the same conclusion that lowering cholesterol, lowering saturated fat in the diet does not decrease heart attack risk. So this is a kind of another mortality one, and it's link number 9, and it's showing that lowered synthesis of cholesterol, so if that's your body's inability to properly produce cholesterol, as well as impaired absorption of cholesterol, and lowered, as a result, lowered serum cholesterol, which is the cholesterol floating in the blood, the wide variety of different lipoproteins that exist, is strongly associated with deteriorating health and indicates impaired survival in old age. And this was a 17-year population study, so this is looking at all causes of mortality, not just heart disease, but that was included in there, and that's, again, that's link number 9. So at this point you might be a bit confused, and I just wanted to sort of go over basically what cholesterol is, how it works in the body, and give you a better understanding that it's not just one thing. Often people reference good and bad cholesterol, HDL and LDL, and that again is trying to simplify something which is much more complicated than that. So complicated I still don't have what I would call a strong grasp of it, but I'm going to break it down the best I can. There's many different types of lipoproteins. In fact, it's almost, you could think of it more as a spectrum as opposed to this type and that type, or 3 types. There's HDL, which stands for high-density lipoprotein, and it's a protein. It's not a cholesterol. There's only one type of cholesterol, and it can be carried in those different things. But these lipoproteins, which are proteins, they're not fat-based things like cholesterol, because cholesterol doesn't dissolve into water. It needs something to carry it or transport it through the blood. And that is a proteinaceous substance that acts almost like a cage. And again, HDL stands for high-density lipoprotein. It's very large and fluffy. And what it's doing is it is bringing cholesterol from the tissues back to the liver to be processed. So doctors and medical researchers have adopted this idea that because it's bringing cholesterol back from the tissues, it's hypothesized that that is improving people's health because it's pulling it out of the tissues, and we don't want it there because we see cholesterol happens to be in the arteries in some cases of people who have died of heart disease, and yeah, we want it out of there, so anything that's going to be taken out of there is a good thing. Then there's LDL cholesterol, but there's actually things that come in between that. There's IDL, which is intermediary density lipoprotein, so that's sort of in between HDL and LDL. But really, it's not very significant to research. It's pretty neutral. But again, that transports cholesterol. And then there's LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein. And this is something that also is starting to be shown to be not harmful, even though many people label that as bad cholesterol. And this is the proteinaceous structure that is carrying cholesterol out to the tissues from the liver. And because it's doing that, people see it depositing, and it's getting deposited, those nutrients and cholesterol, in various places. That is assumed that it's causing heart disease. But it's not. It's actually the step down from that, which is very low density lipoproteins that would be responsible for the buildup of plaque, at least the portion of the plaque that would be cholesterol, and it's actually oxidized cholesterol, that would cause the formation of plaque. So exactly how VLDL and LDL interact is a little more complicated than I can get into in this video, but basically they can shift between the two. They are both going up from the liver as far as I understand it and bringing cholesterol out, but the VLDL is so small and hard, it's hard and dense, whereas the LDL is actually quite a bit larger and fluffier, and it doesn't get caught in the arteries and in the plaque buildup. It's actually the VLDL, which is more susceptible to oxidation, which gets caught, whether it's in a bend in an artery or where calcification has begun to form. And calcification is totally independent of animal food consumption. That's a problem that is a whole different topic for another video. But if that sort of rough surface, at least rough on a molecular level, gets rough enough that it captures a VLDL particle, whereas the LDL particle would be so big it would bounce off it and wouldn't get stuck there, but the small dense ones get stuck, the cholesterol oxidizes from sitting there for so long. It might move in and absorb and become almost like a smooth surface once all this stuff starts building up. And so plaque is actually a composition of many things. There's also the triglycerides in the VLDL particles, which aren't carried in the larger ones. And it's the triglycerides which are now known to be the best indicator for heart disease. So high triglycerides, and comparing that to HDL cholesterol, looking at the ratios of those two and comparing them, is a very accurate way to assess your disease risk. So that's something you should talk to your doctor about or your health practitioner about if you want to get them more up to date on this information of what actually is risky for the possibility of heart disease. It's actually this triglyceride levels, the VLDL levels, and those in comparison to HDL. So link number 10 is an article on a great website, cholesterolandhealth.com, and this is Chris Masterjohn's website. Ton of information on there, definitely check it out. And yeah, this is just sort of a breakdown of LDL and HDL cholesterol, but this is where it gets into the other things like the LDL, or the VLDL, the IDL, LPA, which is lipoprotein A. Another thing I'm not going to get into, but that's another indicator of heart disease. There's the chylomicrons, which are another form of cholesterol. So yes, you can start to get the picture that it's more complicated than just good and bad cholesterol, this sort of dualistic view that seems oddly religious in mainstream understanding of health. I also want to mention that sort of old school ways of looking at LDL cholesterol didn't take into account that VLDL and LDL were sort of different things, that had different things going on for them. So this makes it clear that these older studies that would show that LDL cholesterol increased rates of heart disease and atherosclerosis were actually, there's no way of knowing at this point whether those people that they were studying had very high VLDL and lower LDL, and that sort of blanket look, that blanket statement of all LDL cholesterol is bad, was actually possibly mostly VLDL. There's no way of knowing at this point because cholesterol measurements have gotten progressively better in a very short period of time, and the very old research at this point is pretty irrelevant because they were unable to fractionate the lipoproteins and look at them in a way that was delineating between them much more clear as we now understand today. So knowing this, we need to take into account the way fats behave, or different fuel sources in food behave in the body. So if you were to think about the main groups of fats, there's saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat, and then there's even carbohydrates as a fuel source. And there's protein too, but we're not going to refer to that because generally it's going to be turned into carbohydrates in the blood if it's going to be used for fuel, and that's not an optimal way to use fuel is from protein sources. But fat, those three fats I talked about, out of them all, saturated fat is the most elevating to cholesterol, and that's definitely well understood. HDL and LDL are both raised when you consume saturated fat, but it's not VLDL that's raised. It is the HDL and the LDL that are raised from this. So that's why people say saturated fat increases your risk of heart disease, because it's, again, reverting that bad LDL as being raised. Even though that's beneficial to have, you need LDL cholesterol or LDL lipoprotein. That's taking the cholesterol to your tissues because it's a formation building block for cellular membranes, for patchwork in the body, for proper functioning of mitochondria and the nuclear membrane of the cells. It's needed in every cell of the body. So we need that lipoprotein to carry the cholesterol to those places. It's also needed for the brain. The brain is a very large percentage, ideally, of cholesterol. It's also a very large percentage of DHA and other things. So it's a very fatty substance. The bone marrow needs cholesterol. The skin needs cholesterol. So trying to lower something that our body needs is not logical by any means. So the next type of fat that we have in our diet is monounsaturated fat. And the unique thing about this, and why everyone at a certain point, a couple decades ago, started saying, you know, the Mediterranean diet is where it's at, olive oil is so great, is because monounsaturated fat, which is very high in olive oil, raises HDL, but it brings down LDL. That's, again, fine, because HDL is a great thing to have. And then when we look at polyunsaturated fatty acids, they bring down both HDL and LDL, which is not ideal. So we don't want to have polyunsaturated fatty acids as the majority of the diet, which is what most of the mainstream thoughts are saying at this time. This is the fats in flax, chia seed. It's even in grass-fed animal foods, but again, we need a certain amount of them and in the proper ratio, but we don't need to have them as a major source of nutrition and fuel, because they have that property of oxidizing very easily in the body and also bringing down those healthy cholesterol levels. Then if we look at carbohydrates, they also bring down HDL and LDL, which is why they have long since been touted as healthy foods, but they actually raise triglycerides, and that's also well known. The triglycerides go through a biochemical process and end up as free-form fatty acids in the bloodstream, which is triglycerides, and they're either free or they're carried by the different lipoproteins, and specifically the VLDL. And this again makes up a large percentage of atherosclerotic plaque and gets stuck in the arteries in that form, builds up, and doesn't have health benefits. On the other hand, back to saturated fat, it actually lowers VLDL. So what we see from the animal foods, and we take your typical steak, a large percentage of that is going to be actually monounsaturated fat. Another percentage of it's going to be saturated fat, and then a very small percentage of that's going to be polyunsaturated fat. Take, for instance, bacon. More than half of it is monounsaturated fat, but people are vilifying this food for causing heart disease, when if you were to exactly break down the numbers, I don't have them right in front of me, but 50% monounsaturated fat combined with maybe 40% saturated fat and 10% polyunsaturated fat, you get a net effect of raising HDL a large amount, raising LDL only slightly, because again that monounsaturated is going to be bringing it down, the saturated is going to be bringing it up, but the polyunsaturated is going to be bringing it down, but overall it would go up a little bit, and you're bringing down triglycerides, which is fantastic. You're bringing down the VLDL. So these animal-based foods are not unhealthy when it comes to heart disease. Back to the links, number 11 is a study that shows that cholesterol works as an antioxidant. So that's just another important factor of its effect in the body. And we know that oxidized cholesterol is a harmful substance that gets caught in the arteries and is a contributor to heart disease. So we ideally don't want it to be acting as an antioxidant a lot, because it's going to be, our body might not be able to get rid of enough of it as fast as it's building up. So that's where you want to eliminate pro-oxidant foods and other things that would be causing cholesterol to oxidize. So link number 12 is a study that shows that the high intake of cholesterol-containing diets or foods results in less atherogenic LDL particles in the bloodstream. So this got into the LDL subclasses, which again is that higher density LDL particle and then the very low density particle. And again, it's showing that the cholesterol-containing foods, which is animal foods, is not having a negative effect on increasing heart disease. Link number 13, we're on to now, it showed that low cholesterol is very strongly associated with increased violence. This was a review of many studies, and again, can find that link below. And I posted this one a month or two ago on Facebook, and I got a lot of angry responses from some people, and they were saying things pointing to different individuals, and you can't point to individuals and say, well, that's an example of that, because that is empirical. That's not a large group of people. It's not a study. We can think of people that have eaten meat and been violent. We can think of people that were vegetarian and been violent in the past. But this is specifically looking at low cholesterol in people and that causing more violent behavior. And this is more like criminal behavior. And this is generally in people that are eating animal foods. But when we know that cholesterol levels are associated with intake of animal foods, if they're low, they might not either be eating enough of them, or if someone was vegetarian and they were low, we know that if they had animal foods, that would be higher. And this would prevent these things. But the next group of studies, which is a reference to a great website that I like to peruse, which is link number 14. And this is a search on that site, which you can look through these different blog posts. This guy writes articles and connects them to scientific studies. He's got 43 blog posts already built up, specifically on the topic of low cholesterol being associated with increased violent behavior, increased suicide, increased depression. So all those in that sort of same category. And it's very clear that this is a problem in society, and it needs to be stopped, and we need to stop pushing this low cholesterol mentality, because it's tearing people apart at the seams. So something known as metabolic syndrome is a whole host of diseases that are increasing in our society today. These are diabetes, cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, so that's kind of separate in a way, strokes. So all these problems associated with basically the bloodstream and are very closely related to diet have been linked quite conclusively at this point to carbohydrate intake, whether mostly that's refined carbohydrates, and obviously whole foods are definitely better than any junk foods, but even whole grains, the supposed benefits of whole grains and high fruit diets do increase the risk of metabolic syndrome. This link, which would be number 15, shows that high carb diets are strongly associated with increase in metabolic syndrome, and this was a study done in urban Mexican populations. So they looked at a number of dietary factors, and high animal food diets were not connected. And it was specifically diets high in soft drinks, refined grains, corn tortillas, pastries, oddly seafood was in there, and also whole grains were associated with metabolic syndrome risk. So this result emphasized the importance of preventive nutrition in terms of an intervention on this massive issue that's going on. So that's actually another thing with metabolic syndrome would be obesity. So people who are obese tend to have diabetes or heart disease, or they develop that over time, and vice versa. So it's kind of this closed loop of all these issues. Some people get one, some people get the other, but to some degree they're all at risk. When you start elevating those carbohydrate level of intake, that's what you're putting yourself at risk of. And I know I'll get some angry commenters, but that is definitely more so the refined carbohydrates, but it is connected to whole grains as well. There are definitely, in my opinion, people that do better on slightly higher carb than, say, a paleo-based diet, but there's definitely a broad range here of what works for people. But when we go, the further we go to the higher carb side, we see more of these issues with metabolic syndrome, which we have to admit makes up the majority of the problems that the modernized world is facing today. Link number 16 is a study that clearly shows this thing I was talking about earlier with low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets resulting in a 60% elevation of bad triglyceride concentrations. So the effect of this low-fat, high-carb diet on VLDL triglyceride levels was increased. So there's also something called triglyceride clearance proteins, and those were diminished in their ability to clear the triglycerides from the blood, and these high carbohydrate diets increase the triglycerides in the blood. So that's very obvious. Again, you can look at that study at number 16 below. Number 17, we're now getting into the realm of saturated fat, was a study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is from 2010. This is very recent. This is the biggest meta-analysis ever done on saturated fat. This one really broke news headlines and ruffled some feathers, and people are just not facing up to the fact that the base of their ideologies, their ideological pyramid of what's right nutritionally, is being taken away from underneath them. And this review of 21 studies came to the conclusion that cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease, which could generally be the same thing or slightly different, the risk for that was not associated with saturated fat. So this looked at the way that these studies were drawing their conclusions, and a meta-analysis is a very good way of looking at a large body of research and almost as like it's putting it all together into one clump and treating it like one study and redrawing the conclusions. Wanted to throw in one more study on saturated fat contents in the diet. If you were still thinking that saturated fat was harmful, this is really going to sort of rub in your face and irk you the wrong way. This is link number 18 below, and it clearly showed that saturated fat contents in the diet had virtually no effect on risk for cardiovascular disease. So this was a study on the Polynesian atolls, which is some islands, specifically two groups or cultures were the Puka Puka and the Tokelos. And the Tokeloan diet, which was obviously very similar to Puka Puka, they both have a very high saturated fat diet, but it was also low in cholesterol because the majority of their diet is coconuts. So this is good because it's really isolating saturated fat and seeing what effect it has on heart disease, and it was also low in sugar. The Tokelos low in diet, at least as far as I know, was over 50% coconuts, so that's coconut water and meat. And then they had some fish and a sort of ground melon that was very bitter. That was also starchy. So they had basically an animal food, a seed, and a vegetable that made up the vast majority of their diet. Those were their staple foods. Very high fat diet, had the animal protein in there, and they had fantastic health, no cardiovascular disease, and this really goes against the norm of what we see the mainstream health people talking about. And I'll be discussing the Tokeloans in another video where I focused in more on specifically animal foods and longevity. And there was actually a health study done on them that was separate, that was even larger, that looked at Tokeloans that were emigrating away into New Zealand, and they were having increased levels of cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and this was because they began consuming canned meats, a lot of sugar, a lot of whole grains, and basically overall their diet was becoming much more carbohydrate based. They did have the canned meat there that replaced the fish, but again, that's canned meat, that's not their usual food that they're adapted to. And they were actually smoking less than they were on the island, because they did have freights coming in with cigarettes. They were smoking on the island, and that obviously doesn't have beneficial health effects, but it was interesting to see that even the populations that were smoking less than they were traditionally, they were having these spikes in all these health problems with this supposedly healthy, low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet. So next, link number 19 is another article on Chris Masterjohn's site, cholesterolandhealth.com, and it's looking at the composition of plaque, and that's, again, that stuff that appears inside the arteries mysteriously, composed of a number of different things that is linked to heart disease. And obviously, when this blood flow is decreased by plaque accumulating, that is going to cause problems. Ideally, we don't want to have that happen, but that is actually not the problem. The problem that causes heart disease, or heart attacks, so we'll say the actual thing that can cause someone to die, is when that cap of the plaque ruptures, which is actually the endothelial layer, and all of a sudden blood clot forms, because this is actually a number of things leaking into the bloodstream, and then that suddenly stops blood flow, and when it stops to the heart, that results in a heart attack. When it happens to the brain, it results in a stroke. So I first want to just read this quote from the site, which says, "None of the prominent scientists who promoted the idea that cholesterol is a critical factor in the development of heart disease ever believed anything remotely resembling this nonsense." And by this nonsense, Chris Masterjohn's referring to cholesterol that you eat, ends up in your bloodstream, and sticks to the walls of your arteries. There's actually an endothelial layer, and I'll just continue reading because it discusses that. From the beginning, they recognized that atherosclerotic plaque accumulates behind the layer of the artery in contact with the blood. So that's the endothelium, which is called the endothelium. And that the cholesterol and fat within it is engulfed in white blood cells. So this is a factor of inflammation occurring. That's what the white blood cells would be there for, is dealing with the inflammation that's occurring. So inflammation causes a reaction with the body, and that causes this whole muck of stuff to build up. And yes, there's oxidized cholesterol there, but again, this isn't necessarily from animal foods. There's the triglycerides, there's the polyunsaturated fats, which make up a significant portion of the plaque buildup, because these oxidize very easily and quickly inside the body. And then there's also fibrin, which is a scar tissue-like protein that the body creates to deal with injuries in the body, and that has a very bad collagen structure, so it inhibits tissue elasticity. And then you also have the calcification, which is a very hard rock-like substance that builds up in all parts of the body, but specifically in the arteries, causes the hardening of the arteries. So link number 20 is an article from, or a study from the Lancet, looking at how dietary polyunsaturated fatty acids end up in human aortic plaque. So the findings did imply that there's a direct influence of polyunsaturated fatty acids accumulating in plaque, and suggests that the current trends towards favorably increasing intake of PUFAs, which is polyunsaturated fatty acids, should be reconsidered. So this idea of injecting everything with omega-3 and omega-6s and cooking with vegetable oils, seed oils, throwing it into your smoothie, and doing all this stuff to increase it is not good. We do need some, which should ideally be some sort of fish oil, consuming fish, consuming krill oil, cod liver oil. All these things are beneficial, but we don't want to start megadosing on the plant-based omega-3s or the plant-based omega-6s. There's definitely room for the unique compounds like GLA, which is an omega-6, but it's one we don't get much of. It can be found in spirulina, hemp seeds, and certain other things. And again, plant-based foods are fantastic, make no mistake, but we just don't want to be isolating their oils and consuming them, or consuming a lot of nuts and seeds. They have that inflammatory effect from the polyunsaturated fatty acids, and also tons and tons of omega-3s from other sources is not ideal either. So the solution to having a lot of the problems associated with a high carbohydrate intake is to obviously lower carbohydrate intake. Personally, I feel very strongly that that's beneficial for everyone. There's going to be some people that for sure do better with some degree of carbohydrates in their diet. Whether it's specific percentages, I'm not going to get into. But as you know from the Ancestral Health video, which was another one in this series, and yeah, I'm going to post it right here. Then you can just click the button to watch it if you haven't seen it yet. And you can see very clearly that our ancient diet was never that high in carbohydrates. Different areas and different cultures definitely had larger amounts, but for the vast majority of hunter-gatherer groups, we can see quite clearly that they consume the majority, over 50% of their calories, as animal foods, and then there's a small percentage of tribes and cultures that consume their calories from a higher proportion of their calories, over 50% from carbohydrates, but it was never a low-fat diet in the sense of it being, you know, less than 10%, and it was never a completely plant-based diet. It was never vegan, it was never vegetarian. We've had animal foods for a very long time in our diet, and we are fully adapted to them. So again, there's going to be this range of what's ideal for people. Some people claim to be able to be successful on a very high carbohydrate, very low fat diet, but we've yet to see that in the long run and over multiple generations. So what I recommend is anywhere in the range of what works for you, as long as you have, again, I want to get away from giving exact numbers, but it could be anywhere from a very, very low carbohydrate diet that would put you in the realm of ketosis and running on ketones and fatty acids for fuel, or it could put you in the realm of eating a decent amount of carbohydrates. But again, it's not going to be this high level of staple foods being all starches, fruits, and grains, etc. So I mentioned something there I'm going to get into for the next portion of this video, which is ketosis. This very much maligned, misunderstood, and poorly looked into function of the human body is very important to understand if you are to be successful on it, first of all, and also if you are to successfully attack it and think that it's wrong. Because I've seen a lot of people badmouth ketosis, thinking it's an undesirable state, when the evidence clearly points to the opposite. So one of the major things I'm going to point to, which is study number 21 here, it's link number 21 in the references below, is that ketosis has become a metabolic adaptation that we've evolved to have. So Homo sapiens could not have evolved such a large brain without having been able to run on ketones. So this allowed us to go, as opposed to a primate that doesn't have the ability to run on ketones, such as some things like chimpanzees, they die very quickly in a matter of less than 2 weeks, or a little over 2 weeks or more, if they don't get food. Whereas humans could go very long time in periods of starvation, especially so if they had a bit of body fat on them, they could run on the body fat, then that would fuel their muscles and their brain, as opposed to just eating up their musculature to get glucose to run the brain, which is even harder for the body to do, and it's very tiring, very depressing, and not healthy at all. So when we're fasting for a certain period of time, there's a metabolic that switches over if we've been running on glucose, that causes our body to start digesting the fats in our body. So we start to use that up until we reach a point where we don't have any more fat. Then we'll start eating our muscle tissue, then we'll start eating our organs, and that's when you get someone that's very severely malnourished, which we would see in like concentration camp victims, sort of that very gaunt look, which to me resembles the look of some vegans, unfortunately, or anyone else that goes on these extreme diets that is obviously not getting proper nutrition. So in the idea of ketosis, our body is consuming the majority of our calories from fat, and it develops the same process of what it would be doing if we were digesting the fats in our body that's just subcutaneous if we were not getting any carbohydrates. And so when we're eating food that is high in fat and not getting the carbohydrates that would bring up the blood glucose levels, our body doesn't delineate between the difference between the food in our digestive system that is fat-based, that is fuel, and the body fat that's fuel. So that's also why weight loss diets that are Atkins-based or sort of high-fat based are so successful. So the term for this is ketogenic diets, and I want to emphasize that the advent of these, first of all, there's many cultures that have survived on fats for indefinite periods of time. We don't see strictly carbohydrate-based diets, but in ancient cultures and tribal hunter-gatherers, but we do see fat-based diets or very, very high fat-based diets. And at different portions of the year, sometimes these peoples would also end up being on a ketogenic diet. If it was like in the winter in certain areas of North America, the Native Americans would have been on a ketogenic diet. And then link number 22 below is just a Wikipedia article sort of giving a timeline of low carbohydrate diets in modern culture. So as far back as 1797, which there's an example of Dr. John Rollo reported benefits from treating 2 diabetic patients with low carbohydrate diet. And actually he was using medications as well. But this was the standard way of treating diabetes at the time, and we have somehow lost that wisdom that worked. this would be type 2 diabetes, because it was almost unheard of for adults to get type 1 diabetes unless they got it in childhood. But even that is treated and maintained with a low carbohydrate diet, and there's other ways of working with that to potentially reverse type 1 diabetes, which is mostly unheard of. And if you want to sort of know my ideas on that, you can always contact me with the links below to set up a phone consultation where I can give you some support around that. You can also check out the link below in the section of affiliates to look at to support me, and there's one there that says pasture-raised meat, and this goes through to UNS Wellness Meats, which is a fantastic company that has a wide variety of grass-fed pasture-raised meats such as bison, rabbit, beef, pork, chicken. They even have some raw grass-fed dairy cheeses. They have some grass-fed dairy that's not raw, it's been pasteurized, that isn't a cheese because it needs to be aged over 60 days for it to cross state boundaries and be sold internationally. So yeah, there's some fantastic foods there that you can order and have shipped right to you. And this is one of the best, in fact, in my opinion, it's the best source online for these types of foods, and it's great if you can't get these things in your area. So check out those links and look into them if you are interested in supporting me, which helps me continually pump out these well-researched, very information-packed videos on a regular basis. So then we see link number 23 here, which is in the references below, is a pilot study on the Spanish ketogenic Mediterranean diet. I'm not entirely sure what that incorporated, but it was ketogenic, so getting calories from fat and protein as opposed to carbohydrate foods. And what they found was that it was very good for addressing all the issues of metabolic syndrome. So again, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, stroke, all these problems that are connected with high carbohydrate consumption, and this just further proves my point. I'm now going to go over some of the criticisms of ketogenic diets and just generally the whole ketosis framework for living. And the major thing people talk about is that it makes you slow. It slows down mental processes. So the question is, does it really make your brain slow? And link number 24 below, you can clearly see from this very well put together article that that is not so. It's complicated to explain in this video, so I'm just going to encourage you to look at that article. Beta-hydroxybutyrate is one of the ketones bodies that is created when in ketosis. There's 3 or more that are created. Again, that's getting pretty complicated and out of the scope of this video. But these ketones are very highly concentrated and efficient fuel sources for the body. And when you're in ketosis, your body's going to be running on ketones. There's a variety of them, and then also essential fatty acid. Ketones are specific for certain organs that only run on ketones or glucose, and then a lot of other parts of the body work on essential fatty acids. So again, it was very clear from these studies, this is actually all on mice and other animal studies, and it showed that a wide range of factors across the board increased from physical abilities to cognitive abilities to mental abilities and memory, all increased and benefited from being in a state of ketosis. Link number 25 is a study on, again, showing the better cognition and memory improvement. And this was in humans and 23 older adults. And there was a number of factors that increased when they were in the state of ketosis caused by a low carbohydrate diet. And again, it does acknowledge that more research needs to be done because this is a state of science that is sort of new. But there is a lot of hope and a lot of positive feedback already coming out supporting the idea that ketosis is the ideal state for humans to be in. This would have come about evolutionarily as our dependence on animal foods increased through our development as humans. So another criticism is that you can easily fall into ketoacidosis, which is a very negative state to be in, and that's where the blood starts becoming very acidic, and ketone bodies are involved in that. But that is also, we could also say that everyone that consumes potatoes is at risk of falling into a coma from high blood sugar levels. But we know that happens in diabetics. And again, with ketoacidosis, it is strictly something that occurs to type 1 diabetics, and it's actually untreated diabetics, so this in some cases could be the thing that really wakes someone up to look at their health and say, okay, I've got a problem here, I'm now suddenly type 1 diabetic, I've gone into the state that could have killed me, and maybe in some cases it does kill people, of course. But yeah, that rapidly dropping pH level of the blood is not going to happen on regular ketosis, which is fasting ketosis, or dietary ketosis, which are essentially the same thing. Ketoacidosis is negative. It does not happen to people on these types of diets. So there have actually been people that have been saying and making the claim that ketoacidosis does just suddenly occur in people on low carbohydrate diets, and I would strongly encourage any of you who hear someone saying this to correct them and speak out against blatant misinformation being perpetrated in the nutritional world. The next link, and by the way that last one was number 26 if I forgot to mention that. Number 27 is another Wikipedia article on fatty acids. This is just giving some basic information as to their function in the body when taken in dietarily. And so I'm just going to read this short quote. Fatty acids are important sources of fuel because their metabolism yield large quantities of ATP. So again, fats are 9 calories per gram, whereas proteins and carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Many cell types can use either glucose or fatty acids for this purpose. So they're converting these things to ATP. And in particular, the heart and skeletal muscle prefer fatty acids. So this is out of a medical textbook. You can find the link down below in that Wikipedia article, and is actually the book Biochemistry, which was published in 2006, 5th edition. This is a university textbook, page 579. Authors are Mary K. Campbell and Sean O'Farrell. If you want the ISBN number, you can also look on there. You can order yourself a copy and reference that to see if I'm telling the truth. But again, these are basic understandings of biochemistry that people going to school for biochemistry understand, medical students understand, perhaps if they are actually paying attention to that specific portion, but usually they're not getting that much nutrition information. But yes, this is taught at universities. This is not just some person saying this because they think it's right. This is fact. The body's muscular tissue, which is skeletal muscle, and the heart tissue prefers to run on fatty acids. As we saw in the previous study, the brain works well on ketones. There's no problems there. And yeah, that about sums it up. Another common criticism of ketogenic diets or being in ketosis is that you can't be athletic, you can't do vigorous exercise, and that's simply not true either. There's a number of studies done on athletes that are keto adapted, and they've shown to have been having had a marked improvement on their prior abilities. Very old research on this, such as the same Danish research that came out with the beginnings of the whole carbohydrate loading or carbo loading craze, originally looked at fat-based diets, and they saw that it caused problems, but the studies never lasted longer than 2 weeks or even a month. And really the studies that are longer than that, which have largely been done by Steve Phinney, really showed a big difference. So the next study there below, which is number 28, this isn't actually Steve Phinney. And again, out of the Health Innovations Research Institute, they showed that athletes that became keto adapted took longer than 2 weeks, but they had a number of improvements in how well their body utilized energy, and they became more efficient metabolically in the use of both whatever glucose they had going through their bloodstream, as well as, it would be a small amount of course, but also the burning of ketones and fatty acids gave them an edge on their athletic endeavors. So the common criticism by promoters of high carbohydrate diets is that you don't see a lot of top-level athletes, at least endurance athletes, promoting high-fat diets, or at least ketogenic diets. However, we see the science by the study I just gave, but also number 29 below, is an article that is an interview with Steve Phinney, who's a well-known researcher on low carbohydrate diets as well as specifically athletics pertaining to this, and he talks about the Inuit who would run the equivalent of a marathon every day beside their dog sleds. So, it's possible for humans to do this, whether it's optimal or not for long-distance running or these extreme cardio events is obviously still up in the air because it's not well enough known for people that they're actually succeeding with this and competing at top levels. But the trials, at least in the scientific studies, do show that there's an improved ability by going on this because of the increased efficiency. And if you think about it, an athlete who has adapted to ketosis doesn't have to hit the wall in the ultra long distance events. So this is hitting the wall, it's bonking and biking. There's other terms for it. So if your body's already burning fat for fuel and you run out of fat in your digestive system, you will have ample stores of body fat that your body doesn't delineate between whether it's on your body or it's in your bloodstream from the food you've eaten. So that way you actually avoid that 2-week adaptation phase. So when anyone says that you're running and you hit the wall and that's ketosis and that's bad, well, there's a big amount of time that's needed for your body to readapt to this new fuel source. So that's really not an argument against ketosis, because when you see someone who's hit the wall in running and they've got, they don't want to run anymore, they just feel awful and there's all these things going on, that's because their body hasn't adapted to burning the fat yet. So yeah, that's an important thing to consider. And again, anyone out there promoting that doesn't quite understand physiology and the way things are working, and I would encourage them to read up on that. So there also are a number of athletes that are pro higher fat diets, very high fat diets. They're not 100% what you could call paleo, primal, or low carb, because they are eating, a certain amount of potatoes or yams or even grains in some cases like muesli, etc. But they are very outspokenly for a high fat diet and a lot of animal foods. These are 3 that I have written down here are Simon Whitfield, who won Canada a gold medal in the marathon and Olympics a couple of years back, Summer Olympics, I believe, maybe in Australia. And then Dean Karnazes, he's a famous triathlete. And then also Jonas Kolting. And yeah, again, these aren't ketogenic adapted people, but because of the higher fat content in their diet, their body will be more able to tap into those fat reserves. And that's something they use in their endurance and ultra-endurance events that they compete in. So if this whole mindset that there's only one way that humans can function, and it's on a high carbohydrate diet, when we're speaking about athletics, and all these top-level athletes are on high carbohydrate diets, it's just not true. Otherwise we would see a lot more people on the high carbohydrate, extremely low fat diets, and that's not the case. Another big criticism of high carbohydrate dieters compared to low carbohydrate advocates is that these people advocating these diets are overweight and fat, and it doesn't work to lose weight. And again, this is focusing on individuals and not looking at the science. It's a very simplistic way of thinking and is actually anti-science, because it's not respecting the fact that there are studies out there that have clearly shown, which is looking at large groups of people and has controls and they're set up properly, so it removes that perspective of dogma that can creep into anyone's experience and interpretation of any results. So reference number 30 is an article that outlines 14 or more studies that clearly show that weight loss is much easier on a ketogenic diet than it is on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. It happens much more easily. And that's because if you're on high fat, you're basically constantly bringing that blood sugar level up, which is the glucose, and your body, to burn fat, needs to be able to target that. And so the only way to do that is to bring the glucose down so low that your body starts tapping into the fat reserves for fuel. So if you exercise, and unless you're doing big marathons, you're never actually tapping into that fat source, and you can't reduce that because there's always that blood sugar level that is going to be providing your body with the energy that you need. So things are a lot more complicated than just calories in, calories out. It depends on the type of calories and the rate of your metabolism, which is affected by the foods you're eating, the times you're eating, many other lifestyle factors as well. Again, if you were to think about the idea that when your body is adapted to burning fat, it's a fasting state. It's similar to what happens when we're fasting on just water or nothing at all. And so if we're taking in fats for fuel, our body will use that, but then when that runs out, we've got the fat stores that get used up. The place where I personally think people run into problems is, some people just aren't adapted to be 100%. And so they definitely should have more carbohydrates in their diet. But again, there's these individuals that people point to, and they might have a little bit of a gut, or they might not have lost all the weight that they could have lost, and they're still working on weight loss, and they immediately label that as failure on the low carbohydrate diet. To learn more about the basic biochemistry and the long history of medical research on this and where everything went wrong in the public arena of things, I definitely recommend the book Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. It's very thick, very in-depth read. I'm about halfway through it, but I think it's crucial reading for anyone interested in health on any level, specifically around nutrition and diet. It should be a must-read, just to understand fully what's gone on in the past half century to century of really important research on diet, specifically in the realm of cholesterol, animal foods, and exactly where we've come to in the mainstream's conclusion that in the way they perceive things right now, which in my opinion is on the precipice of major changes. It has to be, because there's just too many problems occurring from the current paradigm we're in. Great example of the problems that a high carbohydrate diet causes in terms of weight gain, or specifically fat gain, is by looking at sumo wrestlers. Now their diet, I've heard some people try and make the claim that it's because of the animal foods they consume. They consume a pot of stew every day, very large one, very calorically dense. It contains fish, some other types of meat sometimes, and probably root vegetables as well. And that is just one thing they're eating. They eat copious amounts of rice. They drink up to 6 beers per meal, and they eat only about, it's also lifestyle, they eat about 2 meals per day, and they don't eat breakfast. They do this right before sleeping, and it's at the end of the day. They exercise on an empty stomach, and all these things slow down the metabolism, increase weight gain, and breakdown of their diet shows that they're eating 16% of their calories from fat, which is not that much more than 10%, which is sort of where the 80-10-10 type diet, fruitarian, low-fat, high-carb diet promoters are ranging around. And so 16 is not much higher than 10, so we really have to consider this a low-fat diet, and they're getting the most of their calories from carbohydrates. So that was link number 31 below, and 32 is a video I've done, and you can check out this link here. It's on AGEs, and this is getting into the topic of insulin and the negative effects it has. So that insulin is going to cause the weight gain over time, and it is implicit in causing these accelerated glycation end products to form throughout the body. The glucose has that reaction at a certain rate, but fructose happens at a 10 times higher rate, so that's more of an issue with advancing aging, and that's a very good watch if you want to learn more about that. One of the best articles I've ever read on the effects of insulin was by Dr. Ron Rosedale, MD, and you can find that at link number 33 below. And this was on Dr. McCullough's site, and he lists a whole host of problems that insulin causes in the body. Big one is aging. Basically, he's looking at some centenarian studies and how overall centenarian is one of the only factors that's prevalent in all centenarians is they keep their insulin levels low, whether that's naturally or through external lifestyle means. And yeah, he goes into a number of other factors such as different organ issues, diseases that are exacerbated by insulin. So this is something we really want to keep low and controlled with a lower carbohydrate diet. Number 34, the final link, is a study on PubMed that you can check out, and it is on insulin degrading enzyme and how it affects the removal of amyloid plaque leading to the brain, which is implicit in Alzheimer's. So when we have too much insulin circulating through our body, even a moderate amount, we want to keep it low, really. But when that's chronically up there, it's using up insulin-degrading enzyme, and there's not enough of it to take away the amyloid plaque. So with carbohydrate-rich diets, you're getting the formation of plaques from the triglycerides, the VLDL. That's going to cause the amyloid plaque in the arteries, other places as well. And the insulin-degrading enzyme is what's responsible for removing that. So earlier in one of the studies in this video, it was also clear that Alzheimer's and other cognitive disorders are very much aided by a lower carbohydrate diet. So again, this is just adding more fuel to the fire of what is truth. So with that, I really highly recommend you go over this video again if you need to. Look at the links below. Definitely also look at the links I have for you to support me. And it's also supporting yourself and your health choices. Got a great link for the animal foods at Eunice Wellness Meats below as well. And yeah, definitely consider this and make a video response if you feel compelled to. And consider what I've had to say in this video as well as in this series. So with that, take care and embrace life without limits.